The wind howled through the cracks in the old wooden barn, carrying with it the bitter cold of Nebraska's worst winter in decades. Thomas McKenna pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders as he walked across the creaking floorboards. His breath came out in white puffs, and his boots crunched on the thin layer of frost that had formed on everything during the night. It was January 1889, and Thomas felt like the weight of the world was crushing down on his chest. He was 34 years old, but lately he felt much older. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the past year, and his hands, once smooth and strong, now bore the rough calluses and cuts of a man fighting just to survive. His farm stretched out for 200 acres in every direction. But right now, it might as well have been 200 acres of nothing. The drought last summer had been brutal. Week after week, Thomas had walked out to his fields, scanning the cloudless sky and praying for rain that never came. He watched his corn plants wither and die under the scorching sun, their leaves turning brown and crispy like old newspaper. By harvest time, there was barely anything left to gather. What should have been a bounty that would feed his family through the winter and provide seed for the next year had turned into a handful of dried, stunted ears. Most of his neighbors had suffered the same fate, but some had savings to fall back on. Thomas had already spent his savings the year before when his oldest boy, little Danny, had gotten sick with pneumonia and needed the doctor. Now, as he stood in his barn looking around at the empty spaces where sacks of grain should have been stacked high, Thomas felt a knot forming in his stomach. In the far corner, sitting alone on a wooden crate, was one burlap sack. Just one. Inside that sack were 50 pounds of seed corn, saved from better times when the rains came regularly and the harvest was abundant. Those 50 pounds represented everything. They were his family's last hope, their only chance to plant something come spring. Without them, there would be no crop, no food, and no money to pay the bank. The farm that his grandfather had claimed during the Homestead Rush, the same farm his father had worked until his dying day, would be lost forever. Thomas walked over to the sack and placed his rough hand on the coarse burlap. The corn inside shifted slightly, making a soft rustling sound that seemed loud in the quiet barn. 50 pounds. It wasn't much, but if he planted it carefully across his best fields, if the weather cooperated, if everything went right, it might be enough to feed his family and have a little left over to sell. But those were a lot of ifs, and Thomas had learned the hard way that hoping for everything to go right was often a fool's game. Back in the house, his wife Elizabeth was trying to stretch their meager breakfast as far as possible. She had gotten up before dawn, as she did every morning, to tend to their youngest, baby Margaret, who was only 8 months old. Elizabeth was pregnant again, her belly just starting to show, and Thomas worried constantly about how they would feed another mouth. Their 3 children sat around the rough wooden table, their eyes bright but their faces thinner than they should have been. Danny, who was 7, tried to act like the man of the house when his father wasn't around. He never complained about being hungry, even when Thomas could see the boy's ribs through his thin shirt. 5-year-old Katie had her mother's gentle spirit and her father's stubborn streak. She shared her food with baby Margaret without being asked, even when it meant she went to bed with her own stomach growling. Elizabeth had learned to make soup from bones and water, to stretch a single potato into a meal for 5 people, and to smile even when Thomas could see the worry in her eyes. She never complained, never reminded him that other families seemed to have more. But he could see the way she counted and recounted their few remaining coins, the way she mended and remended their clothes until the patches had patches of their own. The banknote sat on the kitchen table like a coiled snake, ready to strike. $43.60. That's what they owed by the end of March, or they would lose everything. Thomas had been to see Mr. Worthington at the bank 3 times, hat in hand, asking for more time. The banker was not an unkind man, but business was business. "I understand your situation, Thomas," Worthington had said during their last meeting, "but I have depositors who expect their money to earn interest. I've already given you 2 extensions. I simply cannot do more." Thomas knew the man was right. It wasn't personal. It was just the way things worked. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to accept that his children might be homeless come spring. At night, after the children were asleep, Thomas would sit by the small fire in their fireplace, staring into the flames and trying to figure out a way forward. Elizabeth would sit beside him, mending clothes or feeding the baby, and they would talk in low voices about their options. "We could go west," Elizabeth had suggested one evening. "Some folks say there's opportunity in California." Thomas had considered it, but traveling west took money they didn't have, and it meant giving up the farm that had been in his family for 2 generations. It meant admitting defeat. "Maybe I could find work in town," he had said. "Leave you and the children here and find something in Omaha." But Elizabeth had shaken her head. "We stay together," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it as a family." Now, standing in the cold barn, Thomas thought about all the conversations they'd had, all the sleepless nights spent worrying, all the times he'd seen his children try to hide their hunger. He thought about his father, who had worked the same land and had always found a way to provide. He thought about his grandfather, who had claimed this plot with nothing but determination and faith. The wind picked up outside, rattling the barn doors and sending a fresh wave of cold air through the gaps in the walls. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, and Thomas shivered. It was going to be another long, cold night. He picked up the sack of seed corn and hefted it onto his shoulder. 50 pounds had never felt so heavy. As he walked back toward the house, he could see the warm glow of candlelight in the kitchen window and the shadow of Elizabeth moving around, probably preparing their simple evening meal. For a moment, Thomas allowed himself to imagine what spring might bring. He pictured his fields green and growing, the corn stalks tall and strong, heavy with ears. He imagined the relief on Elizabeth's face when they had enough to eat again, the laughter of his children when they didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from. Those were just dreams, he reminded himself. Reality was a sack of seed corn, a banknote on the kitchen table, and a winter that seemed like it would never end. Reality was the choice he would have to make soon about how to use those precious seeds, and the knowledge that one wrong decision could cost his family everything they had left. As he reached the porch, Thomas paused and looked back at his fields, now covered in snow and stubble. Somewhere out there, spring was waiting. The question was whether he and his family would still be here to see it. The morning of February 15th started like every other morning that winter. Thomas woke up before dawn, his body aching from sleeping on the thin mattress that had seen better days. The house was so cold he could see his breath, and ice had formed on the inside of the windows during the night. He could hear baby Margaret crying softly in the next room, and Elizabeth's gentle voice trying to soothe her. Thomas pulled on his boots and coat, both worn thin from years of hard use. The leather was cracked and stiff from the cold, and he had to work his feet into them slowly. His stomach growled, reminding him that dinner the night before had been little more than thin soup and a piece of bread. But there were chores to do, and animals didn't care if a man was hungry. Outside, the world was a sea of white. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, piling up against the barn doors and making it hard to walk anywhere. Thomas grabbed his shovel and started, clearing a path to the barn, his breath coming out in heavy puffs. Each shovelful of snow felt heavier than the last, and by the time he reached the barn doors, his back was already protesting. Inside the barn, his 2 cows and handful of chickens huddled together for warmth. Bessie, his older cow, looked up at him with tired eyes. She hadn't been giving much milk lately, probably because there wasn't enough feed to keep her healthy. Thomas had been rationing the hay, trying to make it last until spring, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. He milked what little he could get from Bessie, maybe half a cup, and collected the few eggs the chickens had managed to lay. It wasn't much, but it would help stretch breakfast a little further. The chickens clucked softly around his feet, and he wished he had more grain to give them. They were doing their best with the scraps Elizabeth saved from their meals, but it wasn't nearly enough to keep them laying regularly. As Thomas worked, he found himself thinking about spring. In just a few weeks, the snow would start melting, and he would need to decide what to do with that precious sack of seed corn. Part of him knew he should plant every single kernel, spread them across his best fields, and pray for a good growing season. But another part of him wondered if he should sell some of the corn now, use the money to buy food for his family, and worry about planting later. He was lost in these thoughts when he heard something that made him stop what he was doing. It was faint at first, almost lost in the sound of wind blowing through the barn walls. But there it was again, a sound that didn't belong. It sounded almost like crying, but not quite. More like someone calling out, weak and desperate. Thomas set down the milk bucket and walked to the barn door, pushing it open just enough to look outside. The wind hit his face like a slap, and snow swirled around so thick he could barely see 20 feet in front of him. He stood still and listened, straining to hear over the howling wind. There it was again. Definitely voices, and they were coming from somewhere near the edge of his property, down by the old fence line where the creek ran in warmer months. Thomas grabbed a lantern and lit it, though the flame flickered wildly in the wind. He pulled his coat tighter and stepped out into the storm. The snow was knee-deep in places, and walking was hard work. Thomas followed the sound of the voices, his lantern casting strange shadows that danced and moved with each gust of wind. The cold bit at his face and hands, and he had to stop several times to catch his breath. Whatever was out there, it had better be important, because this kind of weather could kill a man if he wasn't careful. As he got closer to the fence line, the voices became clearer. They were speaking in a language he didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, desperation, and something that sounded like prayers. Thomas pushed through a drift of snow and suddenly saw them. Huddled against his fence posts were 4 people, and Thomas's heart nearly stopped when he realized how bad their situation was. There was a man, a woman, and 2 children, all of them Native Americans, all of them clearly dying from cold and hunger. They were wrapped in blankets that looked more like rags, and their faces were so thin Thomas could see their cheekbones clearly even in the flickering lantern light. The man looked up when Thomas approached, and their eyes met. Thomas had seen that look before, in his own mirror during the worst days of the drought. It was the look of someone who had reached the end of their rope, someone who knew they might not see another sunrise. "Please," the man said in broken English, his voice barely above a whisper. "Help us." The woman was holding one of the children, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. The child wasn't moving, and for a horrible moment Thomas thought she might already be dead. But then he saw her chest rise and fall slightly, and he realized she was just unconscious from the cold. The other child, a boy maybe 6 years old, was trying to stay awake but kept nodding off. His lips were blue, and Thomas could see that his feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that were soaked through and probably frozen. "My name is Joseph," the man said, each word an effort. "Joseph. Crowfeather. This is my wife, Running Deer, and our children, Little Fox and Morning Star." Thomas knelt down in the snow, his lantern casting a warm circle of light around them. Up close, he could see that they were all near death. Their clothes were thin and torn, offering almost no protection from the cold. Their faces were gaunt from hunger, and their hands were blue and swollen from frostbite. "How long have you been out here?" Thomas asked. 3 days, Joseph said. "We were traveling to my brother's family on the reservation near Fort Robinson, but the storm came and we lost our way. Our horse died yesterday, and our food ran out 2 days ago." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. Fort Robinson was more than 100 miles away, an impossible distance to travel on foot in this weather, especially with children. "We've been eating bark and snow," Running Deer said quietly, her English better than her husband's. "The children are so weak. I don't think Morning Star will last much longer." Thomas looked at the little girl in her mother's arms. She was so small, so fragile, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. He thought about his own children, warm and safe in the house, and knew he couldn't leave this family to die in the snow. "Can you walk?" he asked Joseph. The man nodded, though Thomas could see it would be an effort. "We can try." "Then come with me," Thomas said, standing up and offering his hand. "My house isn't far." Joseph looked surprised. "You would help us?" "We are strangers." Thomas thought about that for a moment. These people were strangers, it was true, and he had his own family to worry about, his own problems to solve. Taking in 4 more mouths to feed when he could barely feed his own family seemed like the kind of mistake that could cost them all dearly, but as he looked at the children, especially the little girl who reminded him so much of his own Katie, Thomas knew there was really no choice to make. Strangers help strangers, he said simply. That's what makes us human. It took nearly an hour to get them all back to the house. Joseph could barely stand, and Running Deer had to carry Morning Star while Thomas helped guide Little Fox through the deep snow. Every few minutes they had to stop and rest, and Thomas worried that they might not make it. The wind seemed to get stronger with each step, and the snow showed no signs of letting up. When they finally reached the house, Thomas could see Elizabeth's face in the window, her eyes wide with surprise and concern. He helped Joseph up the porch steps while Running Deer followed with the children. "Elizabeth," Thomas called out as he opened the door. "We have guests." Elizabeth's eyes went wide when Thomas pushed open the door with 4 half-frozen strangers behind him. For just a moment, she stood there holding baby Margaret, taking in the sight of the Crowfeather family. Their clothes were stiff with ice, their faces pale and drawn, and little Morning Star hung limp in her mother's arms like a broken doll. But Elizabeth McKenna had been raised to help those in need, and she didn't hesitate for long. "Bring them to the fire," she said, rushing to clear space near their small fireplace. "Danny, help me move these chairs. Katie, get the extra blankets from the chest." The children jumped into action without question. Danny, trying to be helpful, like his father, grabbed Running Deer's arm to help guide her to the warmth. Katie ran to get the blankets, her small feet pattering across the wooden floor. Even baby Margaret seemed to sense something important was happening, staying quiet in her mother's arms. Thomas helped Joseph sit down near the fire while Running Deer collapsed into a chair, still clutching Morning Star. The little girl's breathing was so shallow it was hard to tell if she was still alive. Her lips had a blue tint that made Thomas's stomach clench with worry. "Elizabeth, do we have any of that willow bark tea left?" Thomas asked. His wife nodded and hurried to the kitchen area, still carrying the baby. She knew that willow bark could help bring down a fever and ease pain, something they might need if any of the Crowfeather family had frostbite. Running Deer looked up at Elizabeth with grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought we were going to die out there." Elizabeth knelt down beside her and gently touched Morning Star's forehead. The little girl was burning with fever despite being so cold. "She needs to get warm slowly," Elizabeth said softly. "Too fast and it could hurt her more." While Elizabeth tended to Morning Star and Little Fox, Thomas found himself really looking at Joseph Crowfeather for the first time. The man was probably about Thomas's age, maybe a little younger, but hardship had carved deep lines around his eyes. His hands were rough and calloused like Thomas's own, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. Despite their different backgrounds, Thomas could see they weren't so different after all. "Where were you headed?" Thomas asked, pulling up a chair beside Joseph. "My brother lives near Fort Robinson," Joseph explained, his voice still weak but getting stronger as he warmed up. "He sent word that there might be work there helping with the horses. We've been living off the reservation, trying to make it on our own, but this winter has been too hard." Thomas understood that feeling all too well. This winter had been hard on everyone, but he imagined it had been even worse for people like Joseph's family, who didn't have a farm to fall back on or neighbors who looked like them. Elizabeth brought over steaming cups of the willow bark tea, and they helped Joseph and Running Deer sip it slowly. The warm liquid seemed to bring some life back to their faces, though they were still desperately thin. Thomas could count Joseph's ribs through his thin shirt and Running Deer's cheeks were hollow with hunger. "When did you last eat?" Elizabeth asked gently. 3 days ago, Running Deer replied. "We had a little dried meat, but we gave most of it to the children. Yesterday we tried to eat some bark and roots, but there wasn't much we could find in the snow." Elizabeth's face went pale. 3 days without food, in this weather, with small children. It was a miracle they were still alive. She hurried back to the kitchen and started preparing what little food they had. There wasn't much some thin soup, a few pieces of bread, and the small bit of milk Thomas had gotten from Bessie that morning. But she divided it carefully, making sure everyone got something. As they ate, Thomas found himself studying his unexpected guests. Little Fox was starting to look more alert as he warmed up, though he stayed close to his mother. Morning Star was still unconscious, but her breathing seemed a little stronger. Joseph and Running Deer ate slowly, trying to make the small portions last, but Thomas could see how hungry they really were. The problem was, Thomas's family didn't have much more food than what they'd just shared. Their own children had been going to bed hungry most nights, and Elizabeth had been cutting their portions smaller and smaller to make what little they had last longer. Now, there were 4 more people to feed, and Thomas had no idea how he was going to manage it. After the meal, Elizabeth got the children settled down for the night. She made pallets on the floor near the fire for the Crowfeather family, using every spare blanket they had. Morning Star was breathing easier now, though she still had a fever. Running Deer held her close, singing a soft lullaby in her native language that somehow sounded both sad and hopeful at the same time. When everyone was settled, Thomas stepped outside to check on the animals one more time before bed. The storm was still raging, and he could barely see the barn through the blowing snow. As he trudged through the drifts, his mind was racing with worry. How long would the storm last? How long could he feed 4 extra people? And what would happen when the Crowfeather family was strong enough to continue their journey? Inside the barn, Thomas stood looking at that precious sack of seed corn, 50 pounds of hope, sitting there in the cold darkness. He did some quick calculations in his head. If he sold half the corn, he might have enough money to buy food to keep everyone fed for a few more weeks. But that would mean only 25 pounds to plant come spring, which might not be enough to grow a crop big enough to save the farm. On the other hand, if he kept all the seed corn for planting, how would he feed his own family, let alone the Crowfeather family, until they could move on? The bank payment was due in 6 weeks. Even if everything went perfectly with the planting, it would be months before there was any harvest to sell. Thomas rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. Every choice seemed to lead to disaster. Keep the seeds and people might starve. Sell the seeds and the farm would be lost for sure. There had to be another way, but he couldn't see it. When he came back inside, he found Joseph sitting up by the dying fire, unable to sleep. The 2 men looked at each other in the dim light, both understanding the weight of the situation without needing to speak about it. "You have been more than kind," Joseph said quietly. "But I know this is hard for your family too. I can see that. Food is scarce here as well." Thomas sat down across from him, staring into the glowing coals. "We've had better times," he admitted. "Last summer's drought hit us pretty hard." "We could leave tomorrow if the storm stops," Joseph offered. "We don't want to be a burden." Thomas looked over at where Little Fox and Morning Star were sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Morning Star's fever had broken, and she was breathing normally now. Little Fox had actually smiled when Katy shared her cornhusk doll with him before bedtime. "That little girl of yours nearly died out there," Thomas said. "She's not ready to travel yet," Joseph nodded sadly. "I know. But what choice do we have? We cannot stay here and take food from your children's mouths." The 2 men sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the house was warm and peaceful. Both families were safe for now, but Thomas knew that safety was temporary. Soon he would have to make a choice that would determine the fate of everyone under his roof. As the fire burned lower, Thomas found himself thinking about his own children, sleeping soundly in their beds. He thought about the baby Elizabeth was carrying and how they would feed another mouth. He thought about his father and grandfather, who had built this farm with their bare hands and trusted him to keep it going, but he also thought about Morning Star's blue lips and Little Fox's hollow cheeks. He thought about Running Deer's grateful eyes and Joseph's quiet dignity. These weren't just strangers anymore. They were people who had shared his fire and his food, people who had become part of his family's story. The choice he was facing wasn't really about seed corn, or money, or even the farm. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of world he wanted his children to grow up in. It was about whether being human meant looking out only for your own, or whether it meant something bigger than that. Thomas stared at the dying coals and knew that come morning he would have to make the hardest decision of his life. Thomas barely slept that night. He lay in bed next to Elizabeth, listening to her steady breathing and the soft sounds of the children sleeping, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that sack of seed corn sitting in the barn. 50 pounds that could either save his farm or feed the people who had trusted him with their lives. The storm had finally stopped sometime before dawn, and weak morning light filtered through the ice-covered windows. Thomas got up quietly, trying not to wake Elizabeth, and walked to the kitchen where the Crowfeather family was still sleeping by the fireplace. Little Morning Star was sitting up, looking around with bright, curious eyes. It was the first time he'd seen her truly awake, and the sight filled him with relief. Running Deer stirred when she heard him moving around, and she smiled when she saw her daughter was feeling better. "The fever broke in the night," she whispered. She asked for water and even ate a little bread. Thomas nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The little girl was going to be okay, but that relief was quickly replaced by the heavy knowledge of what he had to do. He had made his decision sometime in the dark hours before dawn, and now there was no turning back. Elizabeth woke up and joined him in the kitchen, carrying baby Margaret. She took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "You've decided," she said quietly. "Yes," Thomas replied. "I have." He told her his plan while she prepared a simple breakfast with what little they had left. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her face growing pale as she realized what he intended to do. When he finished talking, she was quiet for a long time. "Thomas," she finally said, her voice shaking slightly, "if you do this, we could lose everything. The farm, our home, everything your family built." "I know," he said, taking her hands in his. "But if I don't do this, I won't be able to live with myself. Those children would have died if we hadn't found them. How can I turn them back out into the cold with nothing?" Elizabeth looked over at Morning Star, who was now playing quietly with Katie's cornhusk doll. Little Fox was sitting beside Joseph, both of them warming their hands by the fire. They looked so much like any family on a winter morning, just people trying to get by. "What about our children?" Elizabeth asked. "What about the baby I'm carrying?" Thomas had asked himself the same question 100 times during the night. "I have to believe that doing the right thing will somehow work out," he said. "Maybe it won't, but I can't choose fear over what I know is right." After breakfast, Thomas went out to hitch up his wagon. The snow was deep, but it had stopped falling, and the wind had died down. The sun was actually shining for the first time in days, making the white landscape sparkle like diamonds. It would be a hard journey to town, but it was possible. When he came back inside, he found old Pete Hutchins stomping the snow off his boots on the front porch. Pete was Thomas's nearest neighbor, a gruff man in his 60s who had seen just about everything in his years on the frontier. His weathered face looked concerned as he took in the sight of the Crowfeather family. "Heard you took in some folks during the storm," Pete said, settling his bulk into one of Thomas's chairs. "Word travels fast around here, even in winter." Thomas poured Pete a cup of coffee, which was really just hot water with a few grounds. "They'd used 3 times already. They were dying out there, Pete. What was I supposed to do?" Pete studied Joseph and Running Deer with sharp eyes. "They look better than they did yesterday, I'll give you that. But Tom, you can't save everybody. You've got your own family to think about." "That's exactly what I am thinking about," Thomas replied. "What kind of example am I setting for my children if I turn away people who need help?" Pete shook his head. "Pretty words won't feed your babies or pay your debts. You're a good man, Thomas McKenna, but goodness doesn't always pay the bills." Thomas was about to respond when Joseph spoke up from across the room. "Perhaps it would be better if we left today," he said quietly. "The storm has stopped and we have rested. We do not wish to cause problems between neighbors." "You're not going anywhere today," Thomas said firmly. Morning Star just got over her fever, and you're all still too weak to travel. Besides, I have a different idea." He went to the kitchen and came back with a cloth bundle. Inside were the last of their preserved meat, some bread Elizabeth had baked the day before, and a few other items they could spare. It wasn't much, but it would help the Crowfeather family on their journey. But then Thomas did something that made everyone in the room go silent. He walked to the door and picked up his heavy winter coat, the one Elizabeth had sewn for him 3 years ago when they'd had money for such things. It was the warmest coat he owned, and he knew he would miss it terribly. But Joseph's coat was nothing but rags. "Here," Thomas said, holding it out to Joseph. "You'll need this more than I will." Joseph stared at the coat, then at Thomas. "I cannot." "Take this. You will freeze without it." "I'll manage," Thomas said. "I have other clothes. You don't." Running Deer's eyes filled with tears as she watched her husband accept the coat. It was a small gesture, but it represented something bigger. The idea that people could care for each other even. When they barely had enough for themselves, Pete Hutchins watched all of this with a frown. "Thomas, you're being foolish. These people will be gone tomorrow, and you'll still be here trying to figure out how to survive until spring." But Thomas wasn't finished. "Actually, Pete, I need to ask you a favor. Can you drive Joseph and his family to town in your wagon? Mine isn't big enough for everyone, and I need to take something to sell." "What are you planning to sell?" Pete asked suspiciously. Thomas looked at Elizabeth, and she gave him a small nod. She had known this moment would come. "The seed corn," Thomas said simply. The room went dead quiet. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was happening. Pete's mouth fell open, and Joseph looked confused. "All of it?" Pete asked in disbelief. "All of it," Thomas confirmed. Pete jumped to his feet, his face red with anger. "Thomas McKenna, have you lost your mind completely? That seed corn is the only thing standing between your family and complete ruin. Without it, you won't have a crop to harvest, won't have money to pay the bank, won't have anything." "I know what I'm doing, Pete," Thomas said, though his voice shook slightly. "No, you don't," Pete shot back. "You're letting your heart make decisions that your head should be making. This family of Indians will be gone in a few days, and you'll spend the rest of your life regretting this moment." Joseph stood up slowly, his new coat hanging loose on his thin frame. "Perhaps he is right," Joseph said to Thomas. "You should not sacrifice your future for strangers." But Thomas had made up his mind. "You're not strangers anymore," he said. "You're people who shared our fire and our food. You're part of our story now." He went to the barn and loaded the precious sack of seed corn into Pete's wagon, despite the older man's continued protests. 50 pounds of corn that could have fed his family or planted his fields, now headed to town to be sold for whatever price he could get. But Joseph wasn't finished with surprises either. As they prepared to leave, he pulled Thomas aside and pressed something into his hand. It was a small leather pouch, no bigger than a man's fist. "My grandmother's corn," Joseph said quietly. "She saved these seeds when our people were forced to move. She said they would bring blessings to anyone who planted them with faith." Thomas opened the pouch and looked inside. There were 7 kernels of corn, but they were unlike any he had ever seen. They were larger than normal corn, with a deep red color that seemed to glow in the morning light. "Plant these with hope," Joseph said. "The Great Spirit sees what you have done for us. This kindness will not be forgotten." As Pete's wagon pulled away, Thomas stood in his doorway holding the small pouch. Elizabeth came up beside him, and they watched until the wagon disappeared over the hill. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Elizabeth asked. "I don't know," Thomas replied, "but I hope so." That afternoon, Thomas took his own wagon to town and sold the seed corn to the grain dealer. The man offered him less than he had hoped for, barely enough to buy food for a few weeks. It wasn't enough to pay the bank, wasn't enough to solve their problems, but as Thomas drove home in the fading light, holding the small pouch of mysterious corn kernels, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't hope exactly, and it wasn't certainty. It was something deeper than that, the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, no matter what the cost might be. The weeks that followed were the hardest Thomas had ever lived through. The money from selling the seed corn lasted just long enough to buy basic food, but it was gone within 3 weeks. By early March, the family was back to eating thin soup. And whatever Elizabeth could stretch from their dwindling supplies, Thomas tried to find work in town, walking the 10 miles each way in the cold, knocking on every door and asking at every business. But times were hard for everyone, and there was no work to be found. The blacksmith didn't need help, the general store was barely making ends meet, and the other farmers were all struggling just like Thomas. At night he would sit by the fire and turn Joseph's small leather pouch over and over in his hands. 7 strange red kernels of corn, given to him by a man who had nothing left to give. Some nights Thomas wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Other nights he felt a strange peace about his decision, as if something larger than himself was watching over his family. Elizabeth never complained, though Thomas could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. She was showing more with the pregnancy now, and he knew she needed better food than what they could provide. Baby Margaret was fussy and thin, not getting enough milk because Elizabeth wasn't eating enough to produce it properly. The older children tried to hide their hunger, but Thomas could see how their clothes hung loose on their small frames. The bank notice came in mid-March, delivered by a nervous young clerk who wouldn't meet Thomas's eyes. $43.60, due by the end of the month, or the farm would be foreclosed. Thomas read the official papers twice, though he already knew what they said. He had 2 weeks to come up with money he didn't have or lose everything. His family had built over 2 generations. That night, Thomas walked out to his fields in the moonlight. The snow was finally melting, leaving patches of brown earth visible for the first time in months. Spring was coming, but what good was spring without seeds to plant? He pulled the leather pouch from his pocket and looked at it in the pale light. 7 kernels. 7 tiny seeds that were supposed to somehow save his family. It seemed impossible, almost laughable. How could 7 kernels of corn make up for the 50 pounds he had given away? Even if every single one grew perfectly, it wouldn't be enough to feed his family, let alone produce a crop big enough to sell. But what choice did he have? Thomas walked to the center of his best field, the plot of land where his grandfather had first planted corn when he claimed this homestead. The soil was rich and dark here, fed by decades of careful farming. If anything was going to grow, it would grow here. Thomas knelt in the muddy earth and dug 7 small holes with his hands. The soil was cold and wet, but it felt alive somehow, ready to wake up from its winter sleep. One by one, he placed each red kernel in its own hole, covering them gently with dirt. As he worked, he found himself whispering a prayer his grandmother had taught him as a boy, asking for God's blessing on the seeds and the harvest to come. When he was finished, Thomas stood up and brushed the dirt from his hands. 7 small patches of disturbed earth in the middle of a 200-acre field. It looked ridiculous, like someone had lost their mind and tried to plant a garden in the middle of a prairie. But it was done, and now all he could do was wait. And hope that the next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Old Pete Hutchins came riding up the path on his old horse, but this time his face wasn't wearing its usual scowl. Instead, he looked almost embarrassed, shifting around in his saddle like he had something difficult to say. "Thomas," Pete began, then stopped and cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what happened with those Indian folks and, well, I reckon I owe you an apology." Thomas was surprised. Pete wasn't the kind of man who apologized for anything. "I heard in town that Joseph Crowfeather made it safe to his brother's place," Pete continued. "Word is he's been telling everyone about what you did for his family, says you saved their lives." "I just did what anyone would have done," Thomas said. "No, you didn't," Pete replied firmly. "Most folks would have turned them away, myself included. I've been chewing on that, and it doesn't sit right with me." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small canvas bag. "This isn't much, but it might help with that bank payment." Thomas looked inside the bag and saw $15 in coins and bills. It was more money than Pete had probably seen in months, and Thomas knew what it meant for the older man to give it up. "Pete, I can't take this," Thomas said. "Yes, you can." Pete replied. Consider it payment for teaching an old fool something about being human. Word spread quickly through the small farming community about what Thomas had done and about Pete's gesture. Over the next few days, more neighbors began showing up at the McKenna farm. Mrs. Henderson brought a basket of eggs and some flour. The Miller family contributed a sack of potatoes they had stored in their root cellar. Young Ben Cooper, who was just starting his own farm, brought 2 chickens that were still laying. None of them had much to give, but together their small contributions added up to something significant. More importantly, they represented something Thomas had never expected, a community coming together to support one of their own. The most surprising visitor came on a warm April morning, just a week before the bank payment was due. Thomas was working in his garden, trying to make the most of every inch of good soil, when he saw a wagon approaching. As it got closer, he realized with amazement that it was Joseph Crowfeather driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 healthy horses. Joseph looked completely different from the starving man Thomas had found in the snow. His face had filled out, and he wore new clothes that fit him properly. Running Deer sat beside him, and in the back of the wagon were Little Fox and Morning Star, both looking healthy and happy. "My friend," Joseph said as he climbed down from the wagon, "I told you the Great Spirit sees all kindness." Running Deer embraced Elizabeth like an old friend, and the children ran off to play together as if no time had passed at all. But it was what Joseph pulled from the back of his wagon that truly amazed Thomas. "My brother's horses have done well this spring," Joseph explained, unloading several large sacks. "We have more than we need, and we have not forgotten who helped us when we had nothing." The sacks contained corn, beans, preserved meat, and other supplies, enough food to keep the McKenna family fed for months. But Joseph wasn't finished. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch much larger than the one he had given Thomas before. "This is from my brother and his family," Joseph said, pressing the pouch into Thomas's hands. "They wanted to help the man who saved their relatives." Inside the pouch were $45 in gold and silver coins. Combined with what Pete and the other neighbors had contributed, it was enough to pay the bank and have money left over. Thomas stared at the money, hardly able to believe it was real. "Joseph, this is too much." "I can't accept this. You gave us everything when we had nothing," Joseph replied. "Now we give back what we can. This is how the circle completes itself." But the real miracle was still to come. A few days later, Thomas noticed something strange happening in the field where he had planted the 7 red kernels. Green shoots were emerging from the soil, but they were growing impossibly fast. In just 1 week, the plants had grown taller than any corn Thomas had ever seen at that stage. By May, the corn plants were 8 feet tall and still growing. Each plant seemed to be producing not 1 or 2 ears, but dozens of them. The stalks were thick and strong, and the ears were larger than anything Thomas had ever grown. But the strangest thing of all was what happened to the rest of his field. Even though he had only planted 7 kernels in the center of the plot, corn began sprouting throughout the entire 200 acres. It was as if the blessing of those 7 seeds had spread through the soil itself, awakening seeds that had been dormant in the earth for years. By midsummer, Thomas's farm was the talk of the entire county. People came from miles away to see the miraculous corn crop that seemed to defy every law of nature. The plants grew taller than a man on horseback, and each stalk produced more corn than most farmers got from 10 plants. The harvest that fall was beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. He produced enough corn to pay off all his debts, buy supplies for the winter, and still have plenty left to sell. More importantly, he saved seeds from the miraculous crop, sharing them with neighbors who had helped him and ensuring that the blessing would continue to spread. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the miracle crop, he would always tell them it wasn't really about the corn. It was about choosing to help others even when it seemed impossible, about trusting that doing the right thing would somehow work out in the end. Joseph Crowfeather became a regular visitor to the McKenna farm, and the 2 families remained close friends for the rest of their lives. The children grew up together, learning from each other's cultures and carrying forward the lesson that kindness shared creates miracles that multiply beyond measure, and every spring, when Thomas planted his fields with seeds from that miraculous harvest, he would remember those 7 red kernels and the choice that changed everything, the choice to believe that love is more powerful than fear, and that sometimes giving away everything is the only way to truly receive.